Have you ever imagined a regular man, without strength, without power, without an army of soldiers, facing a vast army without flinching? Sounds impossible, right? But this is exactly what happened in the Bible. A man with no military training challenged an army with hundreds of thousands of soldiers. How did this happen? What made him believe he could succeed? You're about to discover that, because this story will challenge your faith, your courage, and your view of what's truly impossible. But before we continue, make sure you're subscribed to our channel, and if you believe these teachings can transform lives, like this video, and share it so more people can discover this story and be edified. The story of Gideon begins during a time of great crisis for the people of Israel. Picture a people without strength, constantly oppressed by enemies, unable to live freely as they wished, as though trapped within their own homes, unable to work or fight for what was theirs. This was the situation of the Israelites at the time. The Midianites, a powerful and cruel people, devastated their land, destroyed their crops, and took everything they could, leaving nothing behind. Amidst this oppression, Gideon appears. He wasn't a hero, much less a leader. He was just an ordinary man, a simple farmer. He was in a field, threshing wheat, hiding in fear of being seen by the enemy. This shows how desperate the situation was. He was doing what should have been a simple task of gathering food, but he was so afraid that he did it secretly, not daring to show himself to the enemy. It was in this moment of total desperation and fear that God appeared to him. Imagine the scene. Gideon is there alone in the darkness when a mysterious voice calls out to him, "The Lord is with you, mighty warrior." God called him brave, but like any of us, he looked around and asked, "Who, me? A simple man who doesn't even have the courage to face a mere enemy. How can I be brave?" This is Gideon's first great lesson. Sometimes it is in our moments of greatest weakness that God sees a potential in us that we don't even know we have. What seemed to be just another simple farmer was, in God's eyes, a potential leader, someone who would make history. God's call to Gideon was bold. When God told him he would be the deliverer of Israel, Gideon didn't believe it. He felt too small for the task. Even so, God didn't give up on him. And this is where the story starts to get interesting. God gave Gideon a command. He was to destroy the altar of Baal, the false god that the people worshipped. But how could a simple man, filled with doubts and fears, go against the idolatry of his people and fulfill the mission given by God? The story takes a fascinating turn. And this is where Gideon begins to question what to do. He knew it wouldn't be easy. But at the same time, the command was clear. Fear still ruled his heart, but he could feel something stronger. Something within him told him he was not alone on this journey. Now I invite you to reflect. If you were Gideon, what would you do? Would you accept God's call? Or like him, would you constantly question whether it's possible? This is what we'll talk about in the next chapter. How can a man filled with fears and insecurities accept a mission that seemed impossible? But don't worry, Gideon's story will surprise you. Did you know that every time you like a video like this, you are helping to spread the teachings of the Bible to more people? Subscribe to continue being part of this mission. After God's bold call, Gideon was still filled with uncertainty. He, an ordinary man, felt completely incapable of fulfilling the task that had been given to him. How could he, someone so small in the face of an empire of enemies, defeat the Midianites, who were already dominating the entire land? And worse, how could he do this without the support of the people of Israel, who were in a crisis of faith and fear? What was God really expecting from him? It was then that Gideon, in his desperation and doubt, asked God for a sign. And this is where the story gets even more interesting, because unlike what many of us might do, Gideon wasn't just waiting for everything to happen magically. He wanted to be absolutely sure that what he was hearing was truly from God. He didn't want to make a wrong move. The first thing Gideon did was lay a fleece of wool on the ground. He asked God that if it was truly him speaking, to make the fleece wet with dew, but the ground around it remained dry. A curious request, right? He wanted something very specific, as if testing God. And as if to show patience, God did what Gideon asked. When Gideon woke up, he saw that the fleece was wet and the ground dry, exactly as he had asked. But that still wasn't enough for Gideon. Doubt continued to linger within him, so he asked for another sign. This time he asked for something even harder, that the fleece be dry, but the ground be wet with dew. And once again, God granted his request, showing him that yes, he was with him, ready to guide him in his mission. This part of the story is crucial because it reveals something very deep about the process of faith. Often it's not that God doesn't call us to something great, but that we can't believe it ourselves. Gideon, though chosen by God, still saw himself as small and insignificant. He wanted reassurance that God was truly with him. And amazingly, God didn't turn away or condemn him, but gave him the signs he needed to move forward. Gideon was beginning to understand that no matter how small he was, God was with him. He didn't need to rely on his own strength, but on something greater. This is the first step in any great victory. Trusting in what God can do, not in what you can do. So, after receiving the signs, Gideon found the courage to take the next step. He didn't know what would happen, but he felt it was time to act. This is the transformation God brings in us when we decide to trust him. Gideon went from being a doubtful and fearful man to someone who, even without understanding everything, was ready to obey the call. But the story doesn't end here, because the next stage is even more surprising. Now that Gideon was convinced it was time to act, God would begin to show him a completely unexpected strategy for victory. And this strategy will leave you speechless. How would Gideon face an army with just a handful of men? Stay tuned to find out what happens next, because the story is about to intensify in ways you never imagined. But before I continue, let me say that every like you leave is a sign that this message is important. Subscribe to keep receiving more transformative content. After confirming that God was truly with him, Gideon knew he needed to gather an army to face the Midianites. The problem? The strength of the enemy army was immense, and Gideon was undoubtedly in a disadvantageous position. He needed many warriors, or so he thought. So he called for all the men of Israel to join the fight, and soon more than 32,000 men gathered ready for battle. But what happened next was undoubtedly one of the most surprising instructions in the entire Bible. Imagine the scene. Gideon was ready to face an enemy feared by all, with a considerable force of 32,000 men. He was beginning to feel the confidence building within him. However, God, with his unique way of acting, had a very different plan. God spoke to Gideon, "You have too many people with you. If you defeat the Midianites, Israel will boast and say it was by their own strength that they won. So tell the men, anyone who is afraid and trembling may return home." Imagine Gideon's shock upon hearing this. The first thing that probably crossed his mind was, "God, what do you mean? I need more warriors, not fewer." But Gideon, with his renewed faith, followed God's instruction. He stood up and told the troops that any man who was afraid could go home. And surprisingly, 22,000 men left the battlefield, leaving only 10,000 warriors. Now things were really difficult. Gideon had expected the men to become more confident, not for the majority to run away. He still felt the weight of the mission on his shoulders. But God, once again, spoke. "There are still too many. Take them down to the water, and I will separate them for you." Gideon, not understanding, did what God asked. He took the 10,000 men to the river, where God made the final selection. When the men drank from the water, some knelt to drink directly from the source, while others scooped the water with their hands and drank from their palms. God said to Gideon, "Those who drank with their hand to their mouth, cupping the water in their palms, will be the ones you use. Those who knelt to drink, send them away." The selection was quick and surprising. In the end, only 300 men remained. Yes, you heard right, 300, less than a third of the initial army. Now Gideon was facing an army of 300 warriors against an enemy force described as innumerable. It was a scenario of total disadvantage, and surely most people would think this mission was doomed to failure. But in the midst of it all was the secret of God's strategy. He wanted Gideon to know that victory would not come through human strength, but through divine power. He was literally reducing the numbers to show Gideon that when you have God on your side, the number of soldiers never matters. True strength comes from faith and obedience to Him. This is where the true test of faith begins. Gideon was about to face an impossible battle without the number of men he thought necessary. He could have despaired, but now more than ever, he knew that it was God who was leading the victory. He no longer had any excuses. The time to act was finally arriving. The situation seemed completely hopeless, but it was exactly this moment of apparent weakness that prepared Gideon to witness God's absolute power. What seemed like a step toward defeat would become the path to the greatest victory he could have ever imagined. Now, with his 300 men ready to fight, Gideon prepared for the final confrontation. The enemy army was in sight, but what would happen next would show how obedience to God can turn weakness into strength. How could such a small group of warriors defeat such a large army? Stay tuned for this video, where God's battle plan will be revealed in a surprising and perhaps even a little unusual way. Now that Gideon was with his 300 men ready for battle, he knew that he didn't have numerical strength on his side. The Midianites, on the other hand, were so scattered and numerous that their numbers were compared to locusts in the mountains, endless as far as the eye could see. Anyone looking at that scene could easily think, "This is impossible, they have no chance." But as we've seen, Gideon's mission did not depend on numbers, but on obedience to God. In His divine plan, God did not choose a conventional approach to the battle. There were no heavy weapons, no direct attacks. God's strategy was, in fact, much more unusual. That night, God spoke to Gideon, "Get up and go down to the enemy camp. Listen to what they are saying, and then you will be encouraged." This was a surprising instruction. Gideon, though now a confident leader, still had doubts, and as brave as he was, he knew this wasn't just any ordinary battle. So he made the decision to go down to the enemy camp with his servant. They approached quietly, and as they listened, they overheard a conversation between two Midianite men. One of them was recounting a strange dream he had. He said, "I dreamed that a barley loaf rolled into the Midianite camp and struck the tent with force, knocking it down and causing it to collapse." The other man, not understanding what this meant, responded, "This is a sign of Gideon, the son of Joash, the man of Israel. God has delivered him into the hands of Israel. They will defeat us." What seemed like just a simple dream had become the key to Gideon's victory. When Gideon heard this, his faith was renewed. He understood that God Himself was working on his behalf, and now he was ready to act with confidence. This small glimpse into the enemy's mind, this supernatural confirmation, was all that Gideon needed to arm himself with courage and move forward. So, in the middle of the night, with God's guidance clearly in his mind, Gideon gathered his 300 men and divided them into 3 groups. Each man was given a trumpet, a torch, and an empty jar. And now it seemed that the battle was about to take an entirely different turn. It almost sounds like a crazy plan, doesn't it? A small army with trumpets, torches, and jars. What would they do with that? There were no cavalry or sharp swords, but that was exactly what God wanted, a symbolic act of complete trust in Him. At the right moment, Gideon's 300 men surrounded the enemy camp, and as one, they began to blow the trumpets, break the jars, and raise the torches in the air. The surprise was immediate. The sound of the trumpets echoed as though an entire army was attacking. The torches shone in the dark of the night, and the broken jars made a crash, like an explosion of power. And that's exactly what happened. The enemy, completely unprepared and confused, thought they were being attacked by a massive force, not by a group of 300 men. They were thrown into panic and, in their desperation, began to fight each other. The Midianite troops became so disorganized that they didn't even realize they were being defeated by a much smaller number of warriors. This move by Gideon, which seemed so nonsensical to any traditional military tactic, was exactly what God wanted. Through this improbable strategy, God showed that victory doesn't come by human strength, but by God's power. With every trumpet blown, every jar broken, God disoriented and divided the enemy, causing them to defeat themselves. Gideon and his 300 men, who had begun the battle full of fear and doubt, were now witnessing God's miracle in action. It didn't require a large army or direct physical confrontation. God used the most unusual and powerful strategy to win. With complete chaos in the enemy camp, Gideon and his men advanced, pursued the remaining troops, and ultimately completed the victory. Once again, God had proven that when you trust in Him, even the impossible becomes possible. Now the victory was almost certain, but Gideon knew that in order to completely defeat the enemy, he would need to act quickly and wisely. He had already witnessed God's power in an uncommon way, but the final step would be crucial. How could he ensure that the victory would be complete and that the Midianites wouldn't return to attack? Stay with us, as in this video, we'll see how Gideon and his army face the end of the battle, where God, once again, proves that His hand is upon those who trust in Him. The final pursuit of the enemy will lead us to a surprising conclusion. After the chaos caused by Gideon's unusual strategy, victory seemed almost certain. But the Israeli leader knew that the job was not yet done. Despite the overwhelming victory over the Midianites, Gideon couldn't leave anything behind. He knew the enemy was still alive and fleeing, and this was his chance to end the threat once and for all. After all, what would be the point of winning a battle but leaving the enemy to regroup for a new attack? Gideon, with his reduced but now renewed and courageous army, gathered the 300 men and made a crucial decision. He sent messengers to the neighboring tribes of Ephraim and Manasseh, calling on them to help in the final pursuit of the Midianites. The battle was not over. There was still a chance to ensure the enemies wouldn't escape and to restore peace to Israel once and for all. Meanwhile, the Midianites, disoriented and defeated, were attempting to flee through the mountains of Gilboa. But panic set in among the soldiers. Each one, trying to save his life, ran frantically with no plan or strategy. Like a flock without a shepherd, they were at the mercy of Gideon and his army. It was in this moment that Gideon's faith was solidified. Not only had God led them this far, but He was also guiding them to the final victory. However, there was still a significant difficulty ahead. Not only did they need to catch the fleeing enemies, but Gideon also knew he needed supplies and support to continue the pursuit. The army was tired and needed to replenish. So he asked for help from nearby cities to provide food and supplies, which unfortunately did not happen as generously as he had hoped. Cities like Succoth and Peniel, when approached, refused to help. They were skeptical that Gideon would be able to finish the task and preferred not to get involved, fearing the retaliation of an enemy that was still strong. But Gideon was undeterred. He knew he was not fighting with human strength alone, but with God's help. He was not alone, and that motivated him to keep going despite the difficulties. So, without hesitation, he continued his pursuit without the support of the surrounding cities. It was at this moment that Gideon decided to issue an ultimatum. He promised that once he had defeated the enemy, he would return to punish the cities that had refused to help, showing that those who align with God will never be alone, but those who doubt him will face the consequences of their actions. And that is exactly what happened when, after an unrelenting pursuit, Gideon and his small army captured the two Midianite leaders, Zebah and Zalmunna. The victory was complete. Gideon and his men, though tired and outnumbered, had defeated a far larger enemy and, most importantly, restored peace and security to Israel. Now, with the enemy leaders captured, Gideon returned to his land. As he passed through the cities that had refused to help him, he kept his promise. Succoth and Peniel paid the price for their lack of faith and support. Gideon's rebuke was not just about justice, but a lesson for all. Trusting in God brings victory, and a lack of faith can cost dearly. Gideon, now with his people in peace, was revered and considered a hero. But he knew that, at his core, the true victory did not come from his leadership skills, but from his obedience to God. The true victory lay in understanding that God's power is unmatched, and that he will always make the impossible possible if people surrender to his will. And as he looked back, Gideon knew that God had not only used the unusual strategy of blowing trumpets and breaking jars, God had also used the obedient heart of an ordinary man with his doubts and fears to accomplish something extraordinary. The lesson was clear. With faith and obedience to God, even the greatest obstacles can be overcome, and the greatest victories can be achieved. But what happened after Gideon's great victory? Did he accept the power that was offered to him? Or did his story have another, somewhat unexpected ending? Get ready, because next we'll explore what happened after the great victory and how Gideon's story didn't end the way many might have imagined. With the victory secured and the threat of the Midianites finally gone, the people of Israel were in a state of euphoria. Gideon, the ordinary man who had been called to do something extraordinary, now found himself facing an unexpected dilemma. The people, grateful for his leadership, offered him an honor he had never imagined, to become the king of Israel. To many, it seemed like the only just choice. After all, who else could command and bring more peace and prosperity to the people other than the man who had defeated such a powerful army with only 300 men? The proposal was tempting. Gideon had already become a national hero, a leader admired by all. After so many victories, the title of king seemed not only deserved, but inevitable. The people believed that his presence on the throne would ensure stability and the continuation of their achievements. The surrounding tribes were united in their acclaim, and even Israel's officials saw him as the best choice. But Gideon knew that the true source of his power did not come from his military abilities or his strategy, but from obedience to God. He was aware that no matter how much the people wanted to crown him, his calling was not to reign, but to serve. With surprising wisdom, Gideon refused the title of king. He looked at the crowd cheering for him and firmly declared, "I will not be your king. The Lord is the one who will be the king of Israel." These words, filled with humility and reverence, echoed among the people, dividing opinions. Some admired his devotion, while others questioned his decision. After all, Israel had never had a king, and the idea of a monarchy seemed promising. However, Gideon was convinced that any attempt to assume such power would be an affront to God's sovereignty. However, by refusing the kingship, Gideon did something else. He asked the people to give him the spoils of war collected from the Midianites, especially the gold jewelry. The people, still overwhelmed with gratitude, readily agreed to his request. Gideon received a considerable amount of gold, and in his heart, he intended to use it for a noble cause. He wanted to create something that would remind the people of their victory and God's faithfulness. However, what began as a good intention soon took a disastrous turn. With the gold, Gideon had an ephod made, a traditional priestly garment worn in the temple. He believed that this object would symbolize God's presence and serve as a reminder of what he had done for Israel. However, what should have been a symbol of worship turned into an object of idolatry. The people began to treat the ephod as something sacred, revering it in the wrong way. Thus, a well-intentioned decision by Gideon resulted in a severe spiritual deviation. The leader who had liberated Israel from the Midianites now saw his people fall again, not into the hands of external enemies, but into the slavery of idolatry. This mistake began to weigh heavily on Gideon's heart. He knew he had failed, that his leadership, once marked by obedience to God, was now contaminated. The people who had once seen him as an example of faith were now divided. Despite this, Gideon tried to move on with his life. He withdrew to his home, where he lived his days in relative peace. But the consequences of his actions continued to grow. During this time, Gideon had many children with his wives, and also with a concubine. From this union was born Abimelech, a son who carried the family name, but whose heart was dominated by ambition. Abimelech grew up observing his father's influence and desiring the power that Gideon had refused. He began to hatch dark plans, envisioning a path to kingship, even if it meant betraying his own family. But how could such a wise and God-fearing man have come to this point? The answer lies in human nature. After so many victories, Gideon began to believe that his position made him invulnerable to mistakes. He stopped seeking divine guidance in every decision and, without realizing it, put the people on a dangerous path. His attempt to please the people with a visible symbol of victory ultimately compromised the purity of his leadership and Israel's faith. What began as a humble refusal of absolute power ended with a complex legacy. Gideon wanted to be remembered as the man who trusted in God and brought liberation to Israel, but his final actions left a shadow over his story. The idolatry triggered by the ephod and the ambitions of his son Abimelech would be the beginning of a new phase of instability for Israel. As Gideon aged and withdrew from public responsibilities, he knew that his journey, although glorious in many ways, had left open wounds. The people of Israel, divided between fidelity to God and idolatry, would face even greater challenges. And Gideon, in his final days, wondered if his choices had been the best to secure the nation's future. Still, in this video, we will explore how Gideon's decisions and the legacy of his children shaped Israel's destiny, bringing consequences no one could foresee. The story is far from over, and the developments promise to be as intense as the events that led Gideon to victory. After Gideon's death, Israel entered a period of transition. The man who had led the people with wisdom and courage was gone, leaving behind a legacy of victories and achievements. But as we know, this legacy was tainted by the idolatry he himself had allowed with the creation of the ephod. The nation, which had already experienced so much chaos and oppression, now faced a different kind of threat, an internal one. And it came from Gideon's own house. Abimelech, Gideon's son with his concubine, was determined to follow in his father's footsteps. However, he did not see the power of God as the true source of his authority. Instead, he viewed the position of leadership as something he could gain through his own actions. Abimelech was not just Gideon's son, he wanted to be more. He desired the throne of Israel. Growing up with a powerful father and several sisters made him believe that his destiny was intertwined with royalty and that he should be the next to rule. What Abimelech did, however, was a devious and bloody plot. He went to the leaders of Shechem, a nearby city, and convinced them that being the son of Gideon, he had more right to the throne than Gideon's legitimate sons, who were numerous. Using persuasive rhetoric, Abimelech promised that his leadership would be stronger and more unified than any of Gideon's sons could offer. To ensure his rise to power, he did not hesitate to use violence. Abimelech gathered a small force of loyal followers and, in an act of pure betrayal, murdered his own brothers, Gideon's legitimate sons. 7 of his brothers were killed mercilessly in a single bloody act. Only Jotham, the youngest brother, managed to escape, hiding and surviving to tell the story. With his brothers dead, Abimelech believed the throne was finally within his reach. He was crowned king by the leaders of Shechem, and Israel, which had already faced so many external wars, was now about to face an internal battle that could destroy them. But what Abimelech did not know was that the price of power, gained through such treachery, would bring devastating consequences. The people of Shechem, who had supported him, would soon begin to realize that they had made a mistake by trusting a leader who sat on the throne through blood and intrigue. The apparent stability Abimelech offered began to disintegrate. His political promiscuity and thirst for power quickly alienated those who had once supported him. Jotham, Gideon's surviving son, appeared before the people of Shechem and made a speech that would become a powerful parable for Israel's history. He told a parable about trees seeking a king, asking the nobler trees, like the olive tree, fig tree, and vine, if they would accept to rule the kingdom. Each one refused, stating they had an important role to play. Only the bramble, a common and insignificant tree, accepted. But Jotham warned the people of Shechem, "Just as you chose the bramble to reign, so you have chosen Abimelech." This parable was a powerful accusation against Abimelech's behavior and the leaders of Shechem. The people, hearing Jotham's words, began to realize the gravity of the mistake they had made. However, the seed of division had already been planted. Abimelech's unrestrained ambition would not be easily contained. His alliances began to crumble, and those who had once supported him now conspired against him, seeing him as an unstable and dangerous leader. Over time, Abimelech saw his authority begin to weaken. Political instability increased, and soon divisions emerged between the leaders of Shechem and other Israelites. What had begun as a rapid and violent rise to power soon turned into a reign of tyranny. Abimelech failed to gain the loyalty of the people of Israel, and distrust and resentment began to grow. The land he promised to rule with an iron fist was now consumed by discord and internal conflict. Meanwhile, the people of Shechem, on whom Abimelech had relied, began to turn against him. A group of dissenters arose, feeding a revolt that Abimelech could not contain. The chaos he had sown in his rise to power now returned to consume him. The betrayal and bloodshed that marked his ascent became the very instruments of his downfall. Abimelech's reign was a tragic reminder that power gained through corrupt means can never produce lasting fruit. As all this unfolded, Abimelech's story approached a tragic and painful end. His reign would not last long, as the very nature of the power he had gained through violence and betrayal would lead him to a devastating fate. But what might have happened if he had followed his father Gideon's steps and recognized that true power comes only from God? This is a reflection that would echo in Israel's history as a permanent reminder. What might have happened if Abimelech had learned from Gideon's mistake, who also gave in to the power of gold and idolatry? The answer to this question is something Israel would learn the hard way. Like Gideon's story, Abimelech's is a lesson about how the desire for power can corrupt even the most well-intentioned hearts, and how unchecked ambition can destroy one's own legacy. Next, we will explore Abimelech's tragic end and the consequences of his reign, and how the stories of Gideon and Abimelech shaped Israel's future in an unexpected way. The story of Abimelech, marked by betrayal and unrestrained ambition, was coming to an end. What seemed to be a meteoric rise to power had turned into a dramatic and inevitable downfall. The land he wished to govern with authority and force was now divided, with his own allies turning against him. Abimelech's reign was destined to be short, and the violence he used to gain power would ultimately be what destroyed him. When the revolt against him reached its peak, Abimelech faced a desperate battle. In a confrontation with the inhabitants of Shechem, his reign met its tragic fate. During the fight, Abimelech tried to take refuge in a tower, believing it would keep him safe. But justice, often unforgiving, was about to catch up with him. A woman from the top of the tower dropped a millstone on Abimelech, striking him in the head. He was gravely wounded, and realizing that he was going to die, he asked one of his servants to kill him, so he wouldn't be remembered as someone who died at the hands of a woman. But in his request, Abimelech did not understand that just as his rise to power had been marked by violence and betrayal, his death would be no different. Abimelech, the man who dared to defy God's will and believe he could build his kingdom through his own strength, fell. His death, dishonorable and without glory, was the final reflection of his pursuit of power. The story of his reign serves as an eternal warning about the consequences of unchecked ambition. Israel then learned that power without God's guidance is unstable. The people of Israel, who had often been swayed by the force and personal interests of their leaders, now faced a profound lesson. Abimelech's death was not just the end of an individual story, but the closure of a cycle of error and a dangerous pattern that could repeat itself if the people did not seek true divine leadership. The lesson that echoes to this day is clear. The desire for power, when driven by self-sufficiency and a lack of faith, destroys not only those who seek power, but also the communities around them. Abimelech is, in fact, a tragic example of how a lack of humility and the pursuit of status can lead to destruction. True leadership is only found when one submits to God's will, as Gideon had done in many moments of his life. Now, as we look at this story, it's important to reflect on the lessons we can apply in our own lives. Are we seeking power for ourselves, or are we allowing God to guide our actions, trusting Him to show us the right path? With the fall of Abimelech, the people of Israel were reminded of the importance of humility and trust in God, and this lesson reverberates through the generations. How can we today learn from the story of Gideon and Abimelech so that our actions and choices are guided by divine wisdom rather than human ambition? In the end, the story of Gideon and Abimelech is not just an Old Testament story, but a life lesson for each of us. True leadership and power do not rest in our hands, but in God's hands. When we seek His will and trust in Him, our paths are blessed. But when we try to do things our own way, we may lose our way, just as Abimelech did. If this story has touched your heart and made you reflect on the importance of trusting God in all aspects of your life, share this video with your friends and family. Leave a comment below about what you learned from the story of Gideon and Abimelech. And if you want to continue learning more about biblical stories and life lessons that can transform your journey, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next videos. Let's grow in faith together and in the lessons the Bible teaches us. See you in the next video.